I'm a futurist or a futurologist or a future researcher or however you want to call it, and it's basically a nice conversation starter, but apart from that, it's really hard to tell what it really means, because the future is that one time that we all don't know anything about because it's just not existent yet. So what do I research? Well, the simple question is, there's all these beautiful Douglas Coupland posters around here, and one reads, thinking about the future means you want something. And I mean, it has a sort of dark feel to it as well, but the thing about the future is that it's kind of deriving from our expectations and from our experiences. So it's a weird mix of something that does exist in our minds and that kind of pre-constructs time. And we have a very good sense of the future when it comes to very short-term actions. So we can cross a street and we can anticipate the cars that might not come and might not hit us and might actually make us get to the other side of the street safely. But we're very bad at imagining futures when it comes to abstract, long-term societal things, because suddenly we stop thinking about what we want and we start thinking about what others before us have thought about the future. So basically, when we start thinking about the future, we start thinking about past futures, about others' ideas of the future that kind of live in limbo with the present because they haven't arrived yet. So whenever there's a future city, you have flying cars, you have jetpacks, you have all these little things that just never happened and still give you an idea that, oh, this is the city of the future. And we're really bound to these, we're bound to these visual ideas because that helps us navigate these uncertain waters. So this exhibition brings us back to a time where the future was a very curious and very a thing that a lot of people wanted to participate in. And it's strange because back then it was super gray. It wasn't a grand time of happiness, but technology was introduced as a great savior. And you got to imagine it was the time before the NASA actually put people on the moon. So there was a great excitement about putting people on the moon. It seemed like magic. It seemed like something that couldn't be done. And suddenly there was technology. And if technology would be able to put people on the moon, I mean, there was no boundaries, no limits. You know, we could live forever. In a sense, that was sort of the spirit that drove these positions that we see here. And it also challenged traditional ideas of what you were expected to do if you were called something. So the radicalness that one curator coined for this sort of architecture isn't necessarily meant that the architecture was radical, but that the architects themselves thought about architectural practice differently. So they didn't necessarily need to construct and build houses or any buildings to be called an architect, but they could actually make collages, they could intervene in the public sphere, they could design clothes, they could do a lot of different things and still be called architect because they would be still working with space in a very wide sense. And I mean, for us it seems pretty normal, but back then it was a bit revolutionary. Then the radicalness also implies that there's a sort of political impetus, that the radicals actually thought that society needed to change. And if you look at this furniture, it does look a bit affirmative. It looks a bit consumptive. It doesn't really look like it's designed against consumer culture. But, and that's kind of a thing that was very hard for me to understand, there was a time where pop was still a political thing, where the idea that you would actually be able to use consumer goods and put them into a politicized context would actually politicize society. And the first image, that was a very long introduction. I'm sorry, I hope it was okay. The first image I add to the exhibition is the kind of the archetype of the collage. It's called Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Different, So Appealing? And it's a collage by Richard Hamilton from 1956. And it was shown in a very famous exhibition in Whitechapel Gallery in London, which is called This Is Tomorrow, or which was called This Is Tomorrow. And what it does, for the first time, it uses commercial advertisements in an artistic context. And I think it's very important to understand that this all leads to a culmination where revolution gets commodified, but it starts out as an almost anarchic act that you would take advertisements and put them into an artistic content. It really felt like the artists were winning. It didn't feel like the industry was winning, but the other way around. And so this is super important. And what's also important is that it creates alternative readings of the present, because it recombines what is there and thus creates something new. It does tell you that something that comes out of nowhere doesn't come out of nowhere, but actually is a recombination of the already existing. And this is kind of what the collage makes so strong. And this is what it makes, what makes the collage something that all these architects used a lot, because it gives an image to an idea and it helps you believe in something that is not there yet. The entire history of gadgets is basically based on the history of science fiction, where certain gadgets were pre-imagined and then some geek started trying to build it and make it feasible in one way or the other. So the collage as the first way of creating freedom, of getting a new world, was really important. And another thing that was really important, I mean, it's a bit mean to say that probably, and probably part of it is wrong, but most of the stuff that we see here, we wouldn't see here, and it wouldn't have been preserved if it wasn't for two magazines, Casabella and Domus, which published most of it and disseminated it and gave it a public. Because most of the collages were made in a studio in Florence, and if they would have published there privately, they would have stayed in Florence. But Casabella and Domus were the leading magazines on contemporary architecture, and they had the impetus to publish all that and get that out into the world. So they made a wave back then with that stuff and had the time to elaborate on some of their ideas, were traveling internationally, were shown internationally, and so that made a big difference. When it comes to that media dissemination, we're at a very different point today. And I think that's really important to point out that what we see here has a has a very nostalgic touch, but I would presume back then it almost had the same effect that what we see now has today.
You see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. That's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources.
It's scary, on the one hand, how elaborate the technology of deep fake videos has already become. And while back then the collage was a means of opening up possible interpretations of possible different readings of the present, the visualization of the present has kind of backflipped, where we really need to look at the undercurrents and the roots and the sources of everything that we perceive as the truth. And so it's really, in that sense, a counter to, because it's really counter to the strategies that these guys used. And I think it's really important. The main thing between utopia and ideology is that utopia is never meant as a one-to-one implementation. It's always just food for thought. It's always just there to think differently. It's never meant to be the manual for a better or other world. But as soon as these two entities are being put together, which we see today a lot, it becomes really dangerous, because it's not about being right or wrong, but it's about accepting that you need to know more in order never to arrive at the point where something can be right or wrong. And so I think this is something that should be shown in class probably every day. Maybe the language will prevent that from happening. The discotheque seems like a very commercial endeavor today. It doesn't really seem like a place for revolution. But just as the furniture we've seen before, back then, having a place to be different really made a difference. And so one of the areas where all these radical architects were really active was in creating spaces for nightclubs. And the image you see here is kind of the New York original, the Electric Circus. And on its first invitation, it said its purpose is to play games, dress as you like, dance, sit, think, tune in, or turn on. And in a way, that was the liberation. So in Florence at that time, after the flood, the historic immanence of the city was sort of challenged. Before that, Florence, with all its history, didn't really have a present because the history was so big. And then this flood came and changed the outlook of the city, created chaos in the historic, and made way for new architects and a new mindset to create these places of experimentation. And part of being as a place of experimentation, of course, was to show yourself, to show the hedonism, be out there, document how different you were, make a scene, provoke, be different, agitate. And if we look at the next image, that has definitely changed in today's club culture. Because what happens now with media dissemination is that you basically have no heterotopian place but the graveyard left. And the graveyard only if you're in a coffin and not if you're visiting. So basically, this is a picture of the Berghain supposedly one of the most famous clubs in the world, which is based in Berlin. And you're not allowed to take your phone in, and there's actually people employed by the Berghain to scan the internet every day and erase all the images of people taking pictures of other people in Berghain. So what actually does happen is that it's a very uncontrolled environment, and I don't know if you've heard any of the stories, but most of them are true. But also, it becomes the last resort of self-expression that is not managed by media. And I think that's also a very strange juxtaposition of the onset that the radicals tried back then, because part of being out there was being in the media, was, disseminating their ideas. And this today turned back into something where you really want to be yourself. There can't be a selfie. And I think that's also something that really has changed. We continue with the next room, which is tiny. So we'll see how we all squeeze in, but it's urban action, so that's good. So we have a sort of felt density already. Okay. Something that you would call today urban interventions. It's ephemeral or very temporal public interventions that make the onlookers perceive the space differently, or see everything that is happening differently. And it's an idea of activism and activation that makes people that walk over a street or go shopping kind of lose their idea of just being mere spectators of the city, as these guys, but becoming an active part of the city. And so all these actions, as funny as they might look, they were all part of trying to become an active part of urban society. It's activism. So basically, Occupy and the Occupy movement and how they occupied spaces is a grandchild of this tradition that also was co-founded by these Florentine radicals. What we see here is a late cover of the Society of Spectacle by Guy Debord, the founder of the Situationist International. It's from '54, and it shows the first screening of the first 3D movie. So this is really, the people as very passive onlookers to the world. There's no movement in these people anymore. And I think to break this society of the spectacle meant to activate public spaces and meant to kind of change the idea how a public space would be conceived. That it wasn't something that an architect planned and that everybody had to carry the consequences, but that it was actually something that could be altered and changed by a mere framing, by just saying out loud that this wasn't a church, but a hospital. Just like very ephemeral things that would, in the end, alter the idea of how you perceive the city. And today, I think we have gone past this urban intervention phase in two ways. One is the commodification of the urban intervention. So there has been so many advertisements, so many spots that actually use that moment of surprise for a product that we can no longer take it seriously as a piece of political activism. But what actually does happen today is that through urban activism, public space is reclaimed as a forum for people to converse and discuss what society they want to live in. And I think that's where Occupy has moved to, and this is a work by Raumlabor Berlin. It's called the Space Buster. It's this little thing they can drive around on a truck, and then they blow up this huge balloon, and it's warm. They can use it in the winter. It's cozy, and it's large enough for a big group to stay there comfortably for a while and discuss what might be wrong with that part of town, where they usually wouldn't even have a place to discuss that. So that's the grandchildren of these guys, and I think that's very important and very important work still to do, and that also is still something that architects do a lot. That isn't a sphere that other professions so successfully work with than architects. So that's the azione. Avanti.
So what you think of the critique of this, that it's creating a new space, but it's creating it in a much more private way than actually those early interventions, and like what that means.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of where the urban action has gone to today, that instead of making a global comment or a comment on the entire city, it kind of tries to make a grassroots comment on a very particular situation. And I think that's the only chance for it to still have an impact, because like all the other urban interventions have been commodified over the last decade, I think, or decades.
So like the ones underneath are somehow more of a performance, maybe you could say, and the one above is really about creating a space for a conversation, and it's that.
Yeah, maybe it's even more architectural, that the architect's job is really just creating a good space where people can actually feel comfortable and start thinking. Because if you're not comfortable, you have a hard time thinking. It's the seminal works of the most famous and most important two groups of the Florentine school. It's Archizoom, led by Andrea Branzi, and it's Super Studio, led by Adolfo Natalini. And both did something that sort of prefigures two things that we are currently confronted in our urban and in any realities, and that is the architecture that has become globalized and generic, and the cyberspace that has become a sort of second layer on and in which we live, if we choose to or not. And so this is very peculiar, because back then in 66, 67, when they started thinking about this, which now really looks like a sort of metaphor of the cyberspace, they couldn't possibly have had any idea that this could happen. And so it's very strange, because it's both very political projects where they kind of take the idea of the situationists that wanted to be the last avant-garde to end all art and transfer that onto the architectural world, where they say they want to create the last architecture to end all architecture. So this is why this super generic and super mega structure that then kind of spreads over the entire globe is sucking up everything. There's nothing but this structure with no ornament, nothing. People just living on a Cartesian grid that provides them with everything. And how could they have prefigured that so well? How could they have thought about it so well? And they were so politically motivated. You know, they were doing the exact opposite. They were showing us these dystopian visions in order to help us not to end up there. This is like an Orwellian idea of saying, okay, if I tell everyone that, you know, if propaganda is able to twist the truth so many times that a lie eventually will become truth, then the people might not end up there. And look at us now. We're just there. You know, it's mind-blowing in a very bad way. Kohlhaas, it's called The Generic City. It's from '95. And he kind of didn't come much farther than Andrea Branzi and Akizum already did. But he wrote, the generic city accommodates both the primordial and the futuristic. In fact, only these two. The generic city is all that remains of what used to be the city. The generic city is the post-city being prepared on the site of the ex-city. And I like how he's a great writer, so how he puts it, how it spreads, how it actually empties the idea of the city of all meaning. That, you know, it's not something that is different from anything else anymore. And if you look at the movie, if you look at the pictures in the back there, and if you look into this thing, there is no urban traits to it anymore, but still it's what we live in and what still is a city, at least on a bit metaphorical level. And let us then stay with Kohlhaas, because he did something that when I first saw it live, I just couldn't believe that it really happened. But what he did in the early 2000s was to build something that would have been a Florence 68 diploma thesis. It's a building that, very openly cites the continuous monument and the superficie, the ideas that we see in this room, but also it's the CCTV headquarters. And it's not the closed-circuit surveillance, but it's the central Chinese television. But it's called CCTV. And it's a giant propaganda machine. It disseminates what the Chinese state thinks its people should know, and that is all produced in this building. Affirmation or protest? Is this an act of accepting the global condition, or is this an architect's attempt to criticize it through its manifold metaphors and citations? It's hippie clothing, really. It's about getting out of the grip of manufacturers that produce clothes that give you a certain idea of your gender and your age, but to free people and come up with their own designs and do their own stuff. Again, architects, and again, that was something that architects did at that time, that they wanted to find ways of experience space differently. And what I add here is three guys from Vienna, from Austria, that built these helmets. The group is called Haus Rocaco. They became quite famous with a lot of these mind-expanding devices they created. And I think it's a very exciting, now that's a nice and exciting combination as well, but it's a very exciting idea at that time that technology would actually make people better, and that through technological devices we could see the world differently, but also through seeing the world differently, making the world better. So there was a very euphoric moment about using these technologies and applying them, and it's the exact opposite of what we experience today when we see these Google glasses or something, that there's always the question, okay, what information does it carry? What does it tell you about the other people that you meet? And this was really naive in a way that they said, well, instead of taking LSD all the time, we can probably use technical gadgets and devices to get into a new state of mind. And so while they were using technology to make themselves feel differently, what we experience today, and so we can maybe move to the next one, is another excitement. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many publications and exhibitions about this specific time pop up now. Because what we experience today is that we understand that we create machines that see the world differently, but that become more and more humanoid. And so we're really curious to understand how the machines see the world. And these guys back then offer us a sort of understanding how, a pure mind, very open to technology, starts seeing the world as a robot, might indicate how robots see the world today as they become more and more human. This room in general is fantastic because it gathers all the different collages of potential future cities of these different groups. So this is what has been most popular in all the magazines. This is the stuff that is very well known, and there's I don't know, but innumerous quotes and copies and alternations in any architecture student's work that somehow relates to these ideas and visions of the city that are gathered here in this room. And I want to point out one work which is a bit different and could also be in the next room, but is here because it's visions of the city of the future that no architect has built, but that is being built just by itself. It's these rock formations, and I really like it because it's exactly the idea of reframing. Instead of making a giant effort in creating a futuristic scenario in which we live in the future, the guy just went to the desert and showed us how the downtowns of the cities of the future look like. I think it's a very nice approach, and it already foreshadows what will happen very soon, imminently in the next room, but also in the room afterwards, that there's a certain tiring of that technological euphoria. Because, and I'm going to talk about that 2 rooms further on, I want to read a quote by Hans Hollein, who is the creator of this fantastic and super influential collage. I mean, it looks very unspectacular, but it's almost like quoted by everyone that has seen it, and it's from '64. So basically everyone knew it and everyone kind of worked with or against it. And he states for that collage, "Today, for the first time in the history of mankind, at this moment when immensely developed science and perfected technology offers the means, we are building what we want, making an architecture that is not determined by technique, but that uses technique. Pure, absolute architecture. And in that spirit, most of the stuff that we see in this room is created. No, there's like, there's something we can do. And that spirit is somewhat lost on Earth. But if you look at the rhetoric of Elon Musk, it's exactly that. And that's SpaceX, Mars program colonies. And it's sort of, it kind of just exchanged the Earth for another planet to basically create a tabula rasa where he can use the same approach to we make megastructures and make everything different and everything new. And yeah, he's like the way he's speaking about it and the way the public and the mediated public is reacting to it is very close to the reaction that these collages got 50 years back. In '68, you've got to imagine there's an exhibition on in Berlin at the moment, and it showcased the student protests of '68 on the one wall and a mail order catalog of fashion of '68 on the other. And you've got to imagine these guys that are getting beat up by the police on the left look exactly like the models in the mail order catalog on the right. So '68 really is a point of no return, where the revolution was commodified, where basically the act of protest became an affirmative action. And that's something that these architects all felt. And so they kind of grew dark. They perceived the nature from a human standpoint, but gave it space. That they said, okay, architecture, maybe not such a great idea. Let nature take over again. And so one of my favorite projects is by Nove. It's a competition entry for the future of the University of Florence. And they said, well, the woods need to come back into the city. The university needs to become a forest again that grows and that develops its own ecosystem, and we as humans will humbly try to find our spaces and places within that ever-growing environment to nurture our knowledge. And just in the same sort of note and in the same context, Ettore Sozzas, we had this beautiful mirror on the other side, really the greatest Italian designer who produced a lot of seminal, kind of very, very colorful and very oddly shaped furniture, started going dark and going black and white, and started to do his own anthropology. And this is from a project he did for Hans Hollein, the guy with the aircraft carrier, exhibition in MoMA in New York, which was called Man Transform. And Ettore Sozzas, instead of putting some candy-colored nice object in, gave 12 of these pictures where he designed objects for animals. And so on the left is the highway between two anthills. He kind of put something there, and on the right it's the design of a television for night butterflies. It's a small plastic television he put there. And he kind of starts to introduce where humanity went wrong into the natural world. So, you know, the anthills, they don't need that massive infrastructure. And butterflies don't need a TV at night. But these objects are there now. And we have to deal with them somehow. And he ridicules that by putting that into the natural world and telling us, well, we probably can live without it. And it features furnitures by Max Lamb. And Max Lamb is a contemporary furniture and designer and artist who kind of now took the heterosotsas and turned it upside down. So what we see here is garbage objects with a rubber cover that look like stones. So he kind of naturalizes artificial objects as a meditation and a critique of current production practice. And yeah, instead of putting plastic TVs in a grass for butterflies, he's kind of salvaging products and making them more natural, but in an artificial way. How to deal with the nature after nature, how to deal with the perception of something that is only perceived as nature because we call it that doesn't need us to grow, but that we do need to grow, more or less. All right, that's Natura. So we go to the last room, La Luna. I would have loved to have that room after the body and before the city, because this is really what I presume is the turning point of this decade. Because what happens is that in '69, the people are on the moon, and in '70 and in '73, it's the two oil crises. And in between, in '72, it's the first time that, in '72, it's the first time that an astronaut makes a photo of our planet, like of the globe, of the thing, as we know it. But that blue marble, as a photo is called, shows the planet for the first time as something very, very, what's the word in English? Well, it can be hurt. It's not very good. It's not very well protected. You know, it's very fragile. It's nothing that can endure all the madness that we do. And so it's on the cover of the First Whole Earth catalog, and it's the image of the birth of environmentalism. It's the first time that people kind of stand up and say, okay, what we do with our planet doesn't work out. And so the euphoria about technological advancement is coming to a halt, and environmentalism as a more subtle, more gentle approach to how to deal with our surroundings is jeopardizing all these future scenarios that all these radical architects came up with. And they all turn to the countryside. They all start studying farmers' lives. They all start studying the simple means and ways to be good. The entire hippie movement that kind of comes out of that, living sufficiently in harmony with nature, all that starts at that point. And so it's a very short, colorful spark that these radicals start out with and that then ends. And I mean, we're again now at a very, very strange turning point, because just this year, this pact, or just last year, this pact that this little planet is fragile is no longer there. It just, environmentalism has come to a certain end. So we're back prior to '72. We're kind of back before we saw the Earth as a fragile little blue thing in the in the universe. And the crazy thing is, just to make that thing round, what did Trump announce in the same month? The revival of the Space Council that was canceled by Reagan. So even the space program as something that really, is kind of the most symbolic predecessor of the then environmentalist movement is being reinstalled. So, we need to stay positive, but I think at the moment it's really hard to do that. But we don't want to end on this. Let's move out. Let's get him away, or let's get away from him. What we see here is a work by Remo Buti, who was he was always the oldest and most quietest of the Florentine radicals. And he did this for the biennial, Venice Biennial in '78. And 78 is the point where most of the groups already didn't work together anymore, and where the curator of the biennial invited the radicals to do a retrospective on their work and to add new works. For example, the salt thing that was in the room back there that stood in the middle, that was created by Super Studio after Super Studio wasn't Super Studio anymore, and for that biennial. And so this is another indicator for the accelerated time, that all these groups that didn't exist anymore 2 or 3 years after their dissembling already went back and did a retrospective on what they did. And that's kind of, something that didn't possibly happen before. And so they all kind of went different ways. They all had their different ideas about life. And although it didn't happen, the idea that all these radicals would be sitting down once again and kind of discuss and talk with each other and be simply there and kind of reflect on what they did in the most simplest way, without any technology, without anything but themselves and the food that was provided, is kind of what sustains, no? That no matter how little truth is being put forward, in the end, it's really about looking someone in the eye and you see if it's right or wrong in that very moment with that person or not. And that direct dialogue, that kind of talking on eye level of letting everyone be as they are, as the precondition to actually be able to talk about something that could be once a future, is the greatest of our talents and abilities, and we need to nurture it in every way. So I hope we change from monologue to dialogue now. And I thank you very much.